he's in prison at this point. He's in Caesarea. He's in this palace, in the dungeon of this palace. He says this, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. He wants to make sure that they're not sitting over in Philippi going, why did God let this happen to Paul? Or everything's so horrible. Right? This is maybe what's an equivalent for us. We might be sitting here thinking, why are all the Christians moving to Alberta and going to Bailey's church instead of coming, and that is, there's a truth to that. But he wants to make sure they're not sitting there belly aching. If you are bold for the gospel, you win by God's power. The gospel will advance. It will advance in Calgary. It'll advance here too, if we are bold for the gospel. What has happened to him being thrown in prison, it has actually served to advance the gospel, he says. As a result, it's become clear throughout the whole palace guard. This is where he says he's in a palace. This is why I think he's in Caesarea. And to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. That's become clear even to people who aren't believers. People who'd never heard of Christ before have all of a sudden heard of him because Paul is in jail because of him. And because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have become confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. So people are knowing that Paul's in jail, and this is what we said at the end of Colossians as well. Remember at the end, Paul said, remember my chains. Why was he saying that? Because if Paul's in chains, if he's in prison for the gospel, and maybe being beaten or tortured, in the end, he's going to be executed. Paul was executed eventually in Rome, beheaded. If that's what's happening to him, well, then it's much easier for me to be bold in the little tiny things I have to deal with in my life, right? What's really going to happen to me in my life if I'm bold for the gospel? Maybe somebody doesn't like me. Maybe. Maybe somebody, I've been yelled at maybe in my whole life as a Christian. I've been yelled at maybe 3 or 4 times by someone who was mad at me for sharing the gospel. What is that compared to this? So as he does this, as he goes through this kind of suffering, it empowers everybody else around to say, well, if he can do that, I can go tell people about Jesus. Now, this is amazing. This is amazing. This next couple of verses. It is true that some of the Christians, he's talking about the Christians here, preach Christ out of envy and rivalry. But others preach Christ out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I'm put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing they can stir up trouble for me while I'm in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. Now, we can't spend too long on this, but this is amazing. Paul is saying that there are other Christians in the city of Caesarea who are his enemies. Why are they his enemies if they're Christians? Because they believe something different than he believes. Remember I told you some of the people in the crowd that tried to kill him were probably Christians. Why did they want to kill him? Because he was teaching something different about the Bible than what they thought was true. They thought you had to follow the whole Jewish law to be a Christian. And Paul said, no, you don't. You just have to believe in Jesus. So they all had the same goal, to preach Jesus. Jesus is the way to salvation, but they believed some different things down here at a little bit lower level. And so some of them were totally against him. Now, this happens, guys. This happens today in different ways. Churches sometimes get into rivalries with each other. But what is Paul's attitude? Even a church leaders who were his enemies are preaching the gospel and succeeding. They're succeeding. They're bringing people to know Jesus. Paul rejoices over it. My enemies are preaching the gospel. I'm in a stinking jail, and nobody, what is Paul's church at this point? No one. There's no one in his church. It's empty. He's in prison. He rejoices because the gospel is going forward.